mean, it's not like China hasn't had the experience pre-1949 with what it's like to be entangled in the imperialist world system, or at least in the emerging imperialist world system of the early to mid, and then, of course, to late 19th century onward to the revolution. I mean, it was a century of humiliation, and China was a very weak country, a very poor country. And so, definitely, I mean, without that socialist base, I just think about the infrastructure development. Without that state ownership which is a key facet of socialism in China, socialism with Chinese characteristics, having the commanding heights of the economy, the banks, the transportation systems, the energy systems, the land, having all of that under the control and direction of the state, of a socialist state, is so key to being able to advance in the way that China has. And all of the other countries that have either been ensnared by the US's imperialist-led economic and military aggression, or those countries that have simply tried to copy or both this system, have not been able to achieve the same success. We can just look at the Soviet Union for what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. One of the poorest countries, it became one of the poorest countries almost overnight, with just absolutely devastating standards of living in just a decade's time. And so, without socialism, yeah, I mean, I think this is just a case for why socialism is I think, the superior system in this era, in particular, in that it is able to bring the stability, it's able to bring the direction, the planning, and just the overall orientation to all forms of development, economic and political and defense. All of it is all geared not toward the profit of the 1%, the few who are able to privately accumulate and own capital, but it's for the benefit of humanity, and that's what we've seen China be able to pursue. And I think it has been very smart and very correct for all of these countries that are now collaborating with China based on China's model of international relations. It's become a global trend. And I think that's huge in this post Soviet era where, for the first decade plus, right, all the way into the US invasion of Iraq, the international order, right? The world order, dare we say. We don't want people coming after us for saying the world order, the new world order, but the world order was in complete and utter shambles, chaotic, and absolutely just so unstable, and so the damage that was done based on the US's ability to assert its hegemony wherever it saw fit. We can't even get that back. But now you have a dynamic where, yeah, the United States killed 1 million people in Iraq and destroyed the country. Now you have China going in and saying, okay, we'll help you build 1,000 schools. We'll help you with COVID-19, protecting you COVID-19. And oh yeah, you can be in the Belt and Road Initiative too. So some of that infrastructure that was destroyed by US bombs can not only be rebuilt, but it will be better than it was before, because now we're moving on to a new stage of economic development. So I think this is all good news. It's just, I think we got to get on board. I think we got to get on board out in our parts of the world. But I want to, I know we only have a few minutes left, Carlos. So I want to get your last thoughts, whatever you'd like to add, and or if you have something that you'd like to, you know, to say in addition.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with everything that you just said, and I think it's just connected to that. Our mutual friend Ben Norton made a speech recently, a really important speech at the last Friends of Socialist China webinar, where he's kind of addressing some of the critiques that have been made from the left in relation to this concept of multipolarity, because some people have said, well, multipolarity is not so great. We had multipolarity before World War One. There were rival imperialist powers. You had Russia, you had the United States, you had Britain, you had France, you had Germany, and they were competing for supremacy, and it didn't bring peace, and it didn't bring balance to the world, and it didn't bring progress to Asia and Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean and so on. So is it really multipolarity? Is multipolarity really the right goal for us to be adopting in terms of what kind of model of international relations we want to see? And Ben made a really important point, which I think is related to what you've been talking about, which is that we're talking about, modern multipolarity is multipolarity with a socialist core. It's not rival imperialist powers. It's not a multipolarity which is driving towards war among people who are competing for control of the world's land and labor and resources. It's a multipolarity which is based on win-win cooperation and opposition to war, opposition to sanctions, opposition to hegemony, and that's a fundamentally different thing. So on that note, as you say, we've only got a few minutes. Let's just maybe talk about the BRICS summit, since we've had a bit of discussion around NATO. To quickly sum it up, I think it was just a showcase of kind of global South unity, of multipolarity, of resistance to hegemony, opposition to Cold War, opposition to sanctions. It was like the opposite of the NATO summit, and that, I think, reflects the nature of BRICS being the opposite to the nature of NATO. NATO is an instrument of hegemony. It's an instrument of domination, of imperialism, of coercion, of war. And BRICS is an instrument of multilateralism, of international law, of upholding the UN Charter, of sovereign development, of this struggle, this kind of generations-old struggle to overcome the legacy of underdevelopment and the obscene inequality that colonialism and imperialism have left us with. So, in that sense, it couldn't be more different to NATO. The NATO countries, what they're talking about, how do we ramp up the new Cold War? How do we attack Russia? And, once we've defeated Russia, or once we've achieved regime change in Russia, how do we then leverage that to attack China? How are we going to maintain our hegemony for another century and more? The BRICS countries are talking about, how do we secure peace? How do we develop fairness and equality in international relations? How do we build prosperity? How do we work together to fight the pandemic or save the planet? I mean, Xi Jinping's speech to the BRICS summit was really important and really interesting. And, it's so clear. He says our first priority is to safeguard world peace. He starts off by saying, I think our world is overshadowed by the dark clouds of a Cold War. And you've got some countries that are trying to, expand military alliances, and they're trying to pursue unilateralism. They're trying to pursue domination. Obviously, it'd be undiplomatic for him to talk about, to reference the US and NATO by name. So he says some countries and some military alliances, but we all know what he's talking about. But he's basically saying that BRICS has got an opportunity to be a trailblazer in pursuing win-win cooperation, in rejecting hegemony, rejecting kind of bullying behavior. And the Chinese in particular have really kind of increased their very vocal opposition to sanctions, like unilateral illegal sanctions recently, which is really important because, obviously they're having an effect on Russia, but in terms of the effect that sanctions have had for decades on Iran, which you've mentioned, on Cuba, which you've mentioned, on Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which has suffered really awful, suffocating sanctions for decades. So if we can use BRICS to be kind of the center of a global movement against unilateral and illegal sanctions, I think that's a really important role that it can play. So Xi Jinping talks about this new BRICS Vaccine Research and Development Center, and how that's the model of the type of cooperation that our countries in the global South can really lead by example on. There's incredible scope for the world to work together on humanity's common problems, right? Pandemics, renewable energy infrastructure, establishing a viable global peace, like ending poverty and ensuring that there's no more famines in the world. These are the questions that the BRICS and that the global South and non-aligned and broadly speaking anti-imperialist countries want to take on, want to address. And the thing that's standing in the way is imperialism, is the US's continued drive to dominate and to maintain itself as a global hegemon. And on the one hand, economically, diplomatically, things are essentially, for the global South, for China, for BRICS, things are moving in the right direction, and history is on our side. But, you know, Mao Zedong did say power grows out the barrel of a gun, and the US still continues to be by far, you know, the most fearsome kind of military power the world has ever known. So that continues to be an important variable that, you know, that we need to understand and be cognizant of.